I'd like to go around the world more or less in the same way as you did. You started with a rather bleak picture of the state of the Arab world and the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the beginning of this week, we saw the beginning of the third big war the West is fighting in the Middle East, and I think we have to start there. You were opposed to the war in Iraq, and in fact it led to your breach with neoconservatism, as you wrote in one of your other books. What was your feeling when President Obama went to war this week?
I think that the United States has this history of going from hubris and arrogance and overextension of power to being excessively passive. This happened during and after the Vietnam War, and I think it was really happening in the United States after Iraq and Afghanistan. So understandably, the American people are really tired of fighting wars in the Middle East, and I think President Obama was responding to that tiredness by being unwilling to get involved in Syria and conflicts elsewhere. But I don't think that that's actually a good thing, because I think actually American power is important to quite a lot of countries around the world, but it has to be used intelligently and moderately. So my specific reaction to what President Obama did, I actually think he flipped back a little bit too far in promising to destroy ISIS, because I actually don't think that we can destroy ISIS. I think the one thing that the last 13 years since September 11th should have taught us is that the United States doesn't have the wisdom or the resources or the staying power to actually produce a specific political outcome on the ground in the Middle East, like democracy or good governance or something like that.
To build states.
To build states, yeah. We don't really, we can't really do that. But we can act as a balancer. We can prevent the worst actors, and there are many really bad actors out there, from dominating their neighbors. And so we can prevent ISIS from attacking the Kurds. We can prevent the Assad regime from restoring its rule in the whole of Syria. And I think that's the role we ought to play. And I think, the president kind of adjusted, but I still don't think he's got quite the right policy.
Yeah, and if America is constantly moving from passivity to hubris, then are we in a hubristic phase again now?
We'll have to see. I think that politically he does not have the support to do anything like putting troops on the ground, and I don't think that would be appropriate in any event. And okay, so you can see how good I am at predicting things, but I actually do not believe that ISIS is going to be that powerful as a long-term actor, just because it's a group that's so extreme that they've managed to unite Saudi Arabia and Iran against them, and they really have no external friends and sources of support. So I think that this is a containable problem.
Okay, but what are we seeing in the Arab world? In the context of your book, you describe everything happening there from the Arab Spring revolutions onward, in comparison to European nation building in the 19th century. And what exactly is that comparison?
Well, I think that people who were expecting a quick transition to democracy after the Arab Spring simply did not understand how difficult it is to construct a democracy. And that's the reason why I've got a chapter in the book talking about what happened in European politics from the revolutions of 1848 up until the establishment of a full franchise across Europe, which really took the better part of 100 years. And so I think that what's similar is political mobilization. You cannot have a democracy unless the citizens actually want to participate politically. And I think the one permanent gain of the Arab Spring is it demonstrated that Arab people want to participate and they don't like tyranny just as much as people in other Europeans or Asians or people in other parts of the world. But what they lack is institutions. And I think that actually the hijacking of that energy by these Islamist groups is very similar to the way that the European impulse towards democracy in 1848 was hijacked by European nationalism. because I think that nationalism and political Islam are very similar. Of course, one's based on language and culture, the other's based on religion, but they're both mobilization tools that are used by politicians, and they both respond to a need for identity. They respond to this need for people to feel that they belong to some big, powerful, important group. And that's, I think, what's unfortunately playing out in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, and that you also say that as nationalism was, political Islam now is distracting these societies from the real items on which you should mobilize people.
That's right.
Social items, political programs.
That's right. That's right. And unfortunately, I think that there's right now a civil war, a sectarian civil war going on between Sunnis and Shiites in that part of the world, and it's going to probably go on for a good long time until it burns itself out, and then hopefully you can construct something thereafter.
Yeah, is that then connected to one of the darker elements in your book, where you state that wars were often very fruitful in creating states? I mean, you quote the famous American politicologist Charles Tilly, who said, "States make war, and wars make states." And you also quote Machiavelli, who said, "Many good things start with a crime." Is that part of what we see in the Middle East, the formation of new states?
So I have to say that I'm not in favor of war. However, as an observer of political development, it is hard not to notice that violence is often important in creating institutions. Abraham Lincoln, early on in the Civil War, because the patronage system was very strong, all of his senior appointments as generals and military commanders were all politicians who had no military ability whatsoever. And the reason that the Union side lost so many battles early on in the Civil War was they had incompetent generals because of politics. And so it was only the pressure of military competition that forced Abraham Lincoln to pick people like Ulysses Grant that were competent military officers rather than simply being politically connected individuals. And so war does have that effect of making people very serious about their institutions. And it's also important, I think, in establishing national identity because, Ernest Renan, the great French theorist of nationalism, once said that nations are only built on the basis of amnesia, and it's a necessary amnesia because if they remembered how violent the formation of their nations was, they would never feel good about themselves. And that applies even to the United States. So, the European settlers who came to North America didn't find an empty land, as they sometimes like to believe. It was populated by a lot of indigenous people that were killed or driven off their lands, and so this is why Machiavelli, I think, was basically right that all just enterprises originate in a crime, and it doesn't mean that the just enterprise isn't just, but it also means that the crime is not a crime.
Especially where national identity is concerned, then apart from war, or as an element in war, ethnic cleansing comes around, and as you say in the book, most of Europe was built after very bloody ethnic cleansing operations. Now, if you look to the Arab world, and especially to the Sunni-Shia conflict with that frame of reference, then we might be in for a long and bloody period there.
I'm afraid so, yes. Yeah. And what's worse is that sometimes people can fight these prolonged wars and it doesn't have any good effect. That's also another. It's also another possible.
And is it good that we mix in, be it hubristic or be it like an offshore balancer, like you just said? Is it good that we mix in, or do we make things worse? Maybe
we could make things worse. I think, though, that. We have an interest in protecting our own interest, and we have, there are groups in that region that we do want to protect. We don't want the Kurds to be overrun. The Kurds have created a reasonably, successful democratic state in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it would be terrible if they're overrun by these fanatics from ISIS. And so I do think that we have reasons for wanting to exercise influence there.
But we should be modest.
We should be very careful, yes.
Okay, let's move around the world to Ukraine, like you did in your talk. As you know, our country was especially shocked this summer by the downing of MH17. Now, you said something about what the internal conflict is in Ukraine. You say it's about corruption, but what's at stake in the confrontation between the European Union and the United States and Putin's Russia?
I think that Putin made a really big decision when he annexed Crimea, because after 1991 and the breakup of the former Soviet Union, there was a big possibility of extended ethnic warfare throughout that region. And it didn't happen because there was a general agreement that Russians who were stranded outside of Russia would stay in those countries, and that Russia wouldn't try to get them back. And so after watching Yugoslavia, I think everybody breathed a big sigh of relief that this hadn't happened in the former Soviet Union. And I think that Putin has thrown this settlement out the window, because he's basically announced to all of those Russian populations that if they're unhappy with their current situation, that Russia is going to come and help them. And this affects Moldova, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the Baltic states, not just Ukraine and Georgia. There are many other places where there are these Russian populations, and I think Putin is not going to be able to control this process, because it sets off a dynamic. Just like the shooting down of MH17, presumably the Russians didn't do it deliberately. It was done by one of their friends out of their control. And so I am afraid that unless there's some much stronger pushback on the part of Western countries, that this is a problem that's going to get worse as time goes on.
Yeah, and what do you think? You said, in fact, this is an old geopolitical game that we know that's being played there. Mm-hmm. Now, in the whole debate here in Holland, but I think in the rest of the Western world too, there's a kind of two camps. One camp saying, well, of course, NATO has to defend everything it can defend, and we have to be as strict and strong as we can to Mr. Putin. And the other camp is saying, but don't forget that the Russians feel threatened for a reason. You were working with James Baker III in 1989 when the wall came down, and there is this rumor that James Baker III made a promise to Mr. Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand on the other side of the Elbe. Is there some truth in that reasoning, that the Russians have a reason to feel threatened by our expansion?
I think that, yes, it's understandable that they feel very resentful, because we gave them wrong advice on many turns. I think in the economic sphere, we gave them pretty bad advice about, quick privatization and other things that really led to a lot of the chaos in Russia at that time. And it's true that expanding NATO in the way that we did drove home the fact that they had lost power and were humiliated and so forth. But I do think, in light of the things that have happened recently, that, I suspect that Russia, once it regained its stability and economic growth, I think would have behaved in a very similar way, because Putin is calling on well springs of Russian nationalism that go back very, very far. They're not related just to the events of the 1990s. Talking about New Russia and reviving this old Slavophile tradition from the 19th century. He really wants to restore Tsarist Russia, and we may think that Tsarist Russia was okay, but it wasn't. It was really hard dealing with Tsarist Russia as well. If you have read any of the recent accounts that have been written about the origins of the First World War, Russia wasn't easy to deal with back then either. So.
Yeah. Now, the European power, European Union power has, for the last decades, always been soft power, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why there were so many people on the Maidan Square in Kiev. And in fact, if you see the rule book by which you have to play when you want to be a member of the European Union, it's much more thick than your book. So that was one of the reasons why these people there wanted to be part of the European Union, to fight that kind of corruption. You say that this kleptocratic regime that was in Ukraine and still is in Russia will not hold out. Why are you so convinced? And what could Europe do, apart from what NATO is doing now towards Putin? What could Europe do to influence Russia in that respect?
So I take China much more seriously than Russia as a coherent alternative model to democracy. Russia is an oil, if it weren't for energy resources, how many of you have ever bought a Russian manufactured product? Everybody buys things from China, but who's bought a Russian anything except for gas? And I think on the gas front, they're very
vulnerable. But we buy a lot of gas, though.
Yeah. But on the gas front, they're very vulnerable because, there's many new sources of natural gas. The United States is moving from being an importer to, potentially being a very large exporter. There's alternative pipelines. And so I would both strengthen NATO, turn it back to its original mission as a defense alliance, and then work towards alternative sources of energy that make Europe less dependent on Russia. And that's something that can be done in the next few years. It's really not an impossible task.
And as far as the appeal of liberal democracy is concerned, you stress in many places in the book that strong institutions, democracy, can only be formed if there is a strong indigenous social agent, if there's social groups inside the country that ask for that and that reinforce that. Do you see that kind of social agent in Russia, and how could we influence that process?
Well, I think you saw it at the beginning of Putin's second term when there were really big protests in Petersburg and Moscow and other Russian cities, and they're all young. They're all the generation that didn't really remember the 1990s and therefore had gotten beyond that. But unfortunately, Putin's control of the media has been so thorough that it's been overwhelmed by this upsurge of nationalism since the annexation of Crimea. But if there is a long-run hope for Russia, I think it's basically that as you get more economic development, you get a bigger middle class, you get more people connected to the outside world that want to be part of the outside world.
So if you're more afraid of China, how does that look in China?
Not good. No, because I think in the long run, China is also going to be a very, big problem. And they've said this pretty openly. They said China was always a great world power. We suffered this 100 years of humiliation at the hands of the West. We overcame that, and now we're back, and nobody wants to recognize that. And this is, I think, the reason that they're making these territorial claims in the Western Pacific. It's not that they care about the resources, under these islands. It's really just saying, look, this is our territory, and we don't want other countries, contesting our dominance there.
And as for social agents inside the country, indigenous social agents, how is the middle class in China developing, both economically and as for their political opinions?
Well, again, I think the middle class has usually been the avant-garde of social change. So right now there's a middle class in China that's probably about 400 million people, and they behave differently from peasants or from the old poor Chinese that of their parents or grandparents' generation. So if you remember this incident a few years ago where their new high-speed rail crashed near Wenzhou, and the first reaction of the railway ministry was to bury the cars so nobody could see what happened. And these Chinese took pictures of it with their cell phones and they posted it on the internet, and basically they complained about this so much that the authorities were first forced to unbury the cars, and then in fact the head of the railways was then sacked and sentenced to death. So there was actually some response.
Talking about strong state.
Yeah. But I think it gives you an inkling of the way that the middle class behaves differently from the old poor China.
Yeah, but still, you say 400 million. That's still a minority. You make another argument in the book that when the middle class is still a minority, they're not a guarantee for this kind of development.
That's right.
You quote the famous Barrington Moore adagium, no democracy without bourgeoisie, but the other thing is not true, that there is always democracy stemming from bourgeoisie. Right. You say that when the middle class is still a minority, like in China, they can also team up with the elite against lower social groups. So what do you see happening there?
Well, I think that's what's happened right now, because the middle class has really benefited from the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. They've gotten rich. And, as far as I can tell, there's very little sentiment to move quickly to democracy on the part of the Chinese middle class right now. I think they'd like a freer China. They would like less government control over what they read and see and do, but one man, one vote, I think there's very little interest in that. And I don't think there will be until the middle class is big enough, and until I think the regime stumbles and makes mistakes, and it's going to happen. I mean, China is not going to keep growing, at 7% year after year for the next 30 years. It's just not going to happen. So I think that moment of decision will come in that society.
And especially because China has been moving from a low-income to a middle-income country, and now it has to move from being a middle-income country to a high-income country, and that makes it more difficult for an authoritarian state, you say.
Yeah, and it's an important test whether, in order to have genuine innovation in an economy, whether you also need political freedom. I sort of suspect you do, that if the government wants to control everything, it's just going to put a big damper on innovation. So I think we'll have to see how that works in the future, because I do think that's a liability for China.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn back to our world and that other main event of the first decade, the financial crisis. What did that do to our democracy? One element, and in fact that is a longer process, not only due to that financial crisis, is the dire situation of the middle class in Western societies, in combination with fast-growing income equality. What does that do to our political systems and to our democracy?
Well, so I think there's two unfortunate things that are happening. So, and they're both related to the growth of inequality. So, on the one hand, you have the concentration of wealth and power in, let's say, the financial sector that, in I think both the United States and in Europe, has really prevented serious regulation. Because those lobbyists are just too strong. But the other big problem is really the erosion of incomes, and this is something that's driven not by individual corporations or banks. This is really the result of broad technological change, that over time more and more jobs get eroded as a result of automation and artificial intelligence and the like. So you just think, when the Google self-driving car becomes present everywhere, how many jobs for drivers are going to disappear? And you think about how many people are dependent on having that kind of job, to support their families. And so this has been a kind of relentless process. In Europe, because of the large welfare state, you've been able to mask this, through redistribution. In the United States, the median income in the United States in 2013 was 8% lower than it was in 2007, the year before the crisis, and roughly where it was a decade before that. So essentially, the median income in the United States has not moved in 20 years. And I think over time, this failure to share the benefits of growth more broadly will erode the belief in the system as a whole.
Yeah. So you said you don't see the social agent yet that is going to provoke the kind of change that was provoked at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, while this process is going on. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the financial crisis did not work to an uprising or a group of people trying to act as a social and a political agent?
Yeah, it's interesting. You would have expected a big left-wing mobilization after the financial crisis, given its origins, but instead, the only people that have been mobilized are right-wing groups, the Tea Party in the United States and these various anti-immigrant parties here in Europe, which is strange. And, I don't fully understand why that is the case. I think part of it, though, has to do with, a kind of failure of ideas on the left, that there isn't a leader on the left that has a way, has a plausible program for really fixing this really big underlying problem of the loss of the middle class. So, when I was just in the UK, Ed Miliband of the Labour Party gave his big speech at their conference, and, his big idea is to raise the minimum wage, and, that's not a big idea. I mean, that's really not going to solve the problem. And so I think that you don't mobilize people unless you actually have a program that people really believe in, and I just think that hasn't been forthcoming.
No, and you don't understand why.
But I don't understand why. I also don't know what the answer is. Don't ask me that question.
Okay, to conclude, let's go to Europe, because you gave some examples of the dysfunctionality in the American political system, being too open to special interests and lobby groups and too many checks and balances. Now, you say in Europe, many countries have a better system because they stem from the Westminster system. They don't have this division of executive power between Congress and the presidency, but you say at the European level, you see a comparison with the American system as far as dysfunctionality is concerned. Should we be concerned, and what does that mean for in the debate to more or less European integration?
Well, I think that Europe actually, taken as a whole, the EU as a whole, actually more and more resembles the United States insofar as power is being distributed at a whole variety of levels, not under a clean principle of subsidiarity, but with duplicated and overlapping powers that gives, among other things, lobbyists more of an opportunity, more access points into the system. But then the most important issue, I think, is the bad allocation of powers. So as far as I can see, from the standpoint of an outsider, the EU is too strong in the wrong areas and too weak in the, also in the wrong areas. So it's strong in all these annoying things like food labeling and wines and cheeses and, all these niggling little standards that Brussels keeps setting. But it doesn't have the most important power, which is a fiscal authority, really to set budgets. And that's, of course, what got Europe into the Eurozone into trouble with the Euro crisis. And so it needs to be much stronger in certain areas and much weaker, I think, in others if it's really going to work over time.
Yeah, but the big debate in Europe is concentrating on that and in how far you can delegate fiscal policy to Europe. Yeah. And then there's the question of sovereignty. So you say, if you want to have something like Europe, you should delegate fiscal capacity to Europe.
I think, unfortunately, that's the logic of having gone to the euro. Now, you could go backwards and get rid of the euro, and there are different ways of doing that, and then this wouldn't be so much of a problem. But yeah, I think I think that the fundamental cause of the euro crisis has just been papered over and it's not been solved, and it will come back again if you don't make a decision one way or the other.